Good morning and welcome to a brand new series going through the book of Deuteronomy. So this is the final book of our series through the Pentateuch. What is the Pentateuch? Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they are the books written by Moses himself. And they really form I'm going to use the word Genesis. They form the genesis of the nation of Israel and all that they went through as you read through the whole of the Old Testament. And they form the genesis or the foundation upon which we understand what the church is and who Jesus is and what he came to do. And so much is based on these first 5 books of the Bible, so that it's been a huge privilege and pleasure for me to lead you through these 5 books on these daily devotions. Now, Deuteronomy is the book that I've often told people is my favorite book in the Bible. And in fact, as I've been reading from Genesis to Revelation over and over and over and over and over and over again through the years, that's how I read the Bible. When I get to the book of Deuteronomy, I will often read large sections of it out loud, because it is a speech, or maybe a compilation of 2 or 3 speeches that Moses gave to the new generation of Israelites after the 40 years in the wilderness, when their fathers were now all dead because of their refusal to enter the land, their lack of faith. They had all perished in the wilderness, and now this new, fresh generation were camped on the Jordan River opposite the city of Jericho, and they were now ready to go in under their new leader Joshua. And the old man Moses, before he dies, because he knew he had to die in the wilderness, God had said he wouldn't allow him to go in, he had one last chance to give an impassioned sermon, I guess, an impassioned plea to this new generation of Israelites to be faithful to God before he died. You know, Moses had carried this people as a father carries his children, close to his heart. Moses had done so much for this people, and now he had to leave them. And so it's an incredible sermon. And I want to comment this morning from chapters 1 to 3 on how Moses begins this message to the children of Israel. He's going to review the law, which is what Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law. But before he does that, he reminds the children of Israel where they came from and where they're going. And that's an important message. So let me just read the very beginning of this sermon to you. This is how Moses starts it. The Lord our God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, "You have dwelt long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go to the mountains of the Amorites, to all the neighboring places in the plain, in the mountains and in the lowland, in the south and on the seacoast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give to them and their descendants after them." And then Moses continues, says, "And I spoke to you at that time, saying, ... So here, Moses begins by saying to the children of Israel, 40 years ago, when we were at Mount Horeb, and it was time to now move towards the promised land and take it, God said to us, "You have dwelt at this mountain long enough." So they had now received the law, they had built the tabernacle, they'd instituted the priesthood with Aaron and Levi, everything was in place, and it was now time to go and enter the promised land. You've dwelt long enough at this mountain, now take your journey and go and enter the land that I've given you. So Moses begins by reminding this new generation how it is that they got to where they are. They're sitting at the banks of the Jordan River. They're about to enter the promised land. Why are they about to enter the promised land? Because God 40 years ago said, "You've dwelt long enough at this mountain. Go and enter the promised land." That's why you're here. That's why you still have this task before you. He then recounts how they received their leadership. So he explains how the judges came to be in the nation, how there came to be captains of thousands, of hundreds, and of tens. And that was also important for them. If they were going to submit to the leadership that they had in place in the nation, it was important they remembered how this leadership structure came to be. It was God ordained. He then recounts the refusal to enter the land But it was, Moses says to this new generation, after God had given this instruction, your fathers refused to believe him. And they wanted to go back to Egypt. And then after God swore that they would all die in the wilderness, they then regretted their faithlessness. They tried to go into the land. And God told them, don't. I'm not going to be with you if you try to go in now. And many of them were slaughtered by the Amorites in the mountains. And so it was that they spent 40 years in the wilderness because their parents refused to believe. And so this, now remembering that event, was going to be a warning to this new generation. So remember the weaknesses and sins of the past. Remember the impact that disobedience has had upon your family. These are some of the lessons we bring out here. Then the desert years are recounted. So what was it like during that 40 years? Well, Moses says to them, you remember, you were children and you were growing up. Many of them had grown up through their teenage years into adulthood in this wilderness. And he says, you remember what it was like. We wandered around for 40 years because of the disobedience of your parents. And he says, we had to literally beg for bread and beg for water and beg other nations not to attack us. You remember how demoralizing it was. He reminds them of what that time was like, and yet he reminds them of how God actually did carry them through it. That you yourself know that though you've had hardship in the past and God has perhaps dealt with you in discipline, that even through the worst times of your life, you will remember that God was carrying you. He was still with you. He fed you, he supplied your needs, and it's good to remember that even through those years of discipline, God is with you. Another lesson we draw out of this, Moses is reminding them where they came from. He then recounts what had happened in the previous 2 years or so, where now this new generation needed to be trained for war, and God providentially saw to it by hardening the heart of two kings, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. They had to be taught battle. And the Israelites entered battle with these two kings and completely annihilated those two tribes. And Moses reminds this new generation of that. And that was going to be important because that was to be remembered when they crossed that Jordan River and they now entered into full-fledged warfare with the 7 nations of the land of Canaan. Moses was saying to the children, do not fear the war that is coming, because there is war coming. But you now remember what God has done to the Amorites and to Og, king of Bashan, and he will do the same to your enemies. Don't you dare fear when you cross the Jordan River. And that's recounted. And then the last thing he reminds them of is how the land was to be divided. So he reminds them of how God had given them instructions for the future. That when you enter that land, you don't just do what you want. There's going to be no fighting amongst you. This is how God wants to deal with you. This is how the land will be divided by lot. And I guess the Lord wants to do the same for us. He wants to remind us of what he's called us to. So as you stand on the edge of your Jordan River and you're ready to enter some new season of your life, don't forget the instructions God has given you. Do you feel like God has told you to do something? Well, when you enter your new land, don't forget those things. So I know this has been a bit of a ramble, but it's a good ramble. There's something in all of this that you can take away, that as God sets you up for the next season of your life, he wants you to remember your past. He wants you to remember how you got to where you are now. So take a moment and reflect. Reflect on what God has spoken. Reflect on the moments of discipline and hardship. Reflect on the victories that you've had. Reflect on the instructions for the future. And remember all these things as you move forward in faith. I'll see you tomorrow.